Morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Looks like we've got a good list going. Wait a little bit longer for a few more folks. Okay, still see people coming in. Give it another minute or so for folks to get logged on. Okay, we're up to 24. It's looking good. Oh, thank you for turning on cameras. I can see folks. Nice to see you all.
It was kind of weird. I had a message pop up saying your camera's been disabled. You cannot share video. So I was like, oh, okay.
That's what
But
mine said too. Mine said that same thing. That's so weird.
I tried it and it works. So
maybe Teams is just trying to keep us on our toes. Right. Well, we're at 9:03, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I do have a little roll call question for us. Marianne, I was wondering if you would be able to call names so I can take some notes on folks' answers to our welcome roll call question.
I would be happy to.
I just tried to paste my question to chat and it looks huge. I don't know why. Okay, there we go. Thank you very much, Marianne. So in the chat, we have a little roll call question. So when your name is called, just say here and respond to our question, which is, since today's presentation is about uniform application procedures, I would like folks to try to share at least one example of an inefficiency or redundancy that you hope could be cured with a recommendation from this group on a uniform application process. I'm sure folks have many examples, but you only have to share one. And if you can, think about in the state context, because I know a lot of us work in multiple jurisdictions, and so you may have experienced some of those kind of inefficiencies in maybe other government jurisdictions. But let's try to think of what's kind of relevant, at least for at the state level. So Marianne, I'll kick it off to you to call names, and I'll remember to mute myself this time because people heard me typing last time. Thank you.
Good morning, Bettina.
Here, the main thing that I would like to change is just that our organizational information, like the Form 990 insurance certificates, would be available for all applications, and we wouldn't have to submit them several times.
Dinesh.
Yeah, I was actually thinking somewhat similar. The timely information like a 990 or W9s, that sort of thing, if there's ways that could automatically be updated.
Felicita.
Good morning. Here. The first thing that comes to mind, much like the 990, is to me, ideally, if something is answered in the 990, it wouldn't be asked somewhere else. So there wouldn't be that repetition because that information has already been received and is accurate. Thanks.
Heather.
Oh man, this is a tough one to start the day off with. I think that there is a lack of communication within departments to communicate those same pieces of information, like you're pointing out. And we get random staff get contacted around these different opportunities, and it doesn't seem like there's a consistent way that entire agencies or departments are communicating. So it would be helpful if, like the application process, if there could be like share information with each other around who to contact within organizations.
Katrina Holland. I didn't see her on the list.
We just let her in. She just arrived.
Okay.
Maybe we can come back to her since she just popped in.
Okay. Leah. Leah Seavey.
Good morning. I was thinking it would be nice if there was a repository where all these basic informational pieces could go, so that for all of the things that are asked for, your proof of insurance, your 990, your whatever, if there was one repository for everything.
Tamara Henderson.
Good morning. I think people have kind of hit on them. For me, it's the differing, I think similar to Dinesh, differing financial documents. It'd be awesome if we get them the same one every time instead of each one's asking for something slightly different.
Mercedes.
Here, and I would say it would be great to have a standard way that budgets are collected, so that like every state department uses a single budget platform, just like any organization would have each of its departments using a single budget platform. Like it would drive our finance departments nuts, right? If we had like, the housing department had a different budget than the healthcare department or the education department. Like, so we all have to use the same one. And so it'd be great if state agencies all use the same one. So whether we were submitting for a new application or an update, we're all just using the one budget tool.
So Katrina Holland came in, but I don't think she might have heard this question that you asked.
No, I did not. I did not.
I will repaste it into the chat, and I'll also read it back out again, just in case we have anyone else who came on. So since today's presentation is about uniform application procedures, what is one example of an inefficiency or a redundancy that you hope could be cured with a recommendation from this body on a uniform application process?
Oh, that's a big question. I think probably
the method by which we calculate administrative costs, though I don't necessarily agree with the joint office's methodology. They recently made a change in Multnomah County that's based off of the cost from the previous year. And each organization that is contracted in that space sort of knows what to expect and therefore can reasonably assume what their indirect rate will be as a result of their contracting. And as a result of that, I believe that they also took away some arbitrary rules around limitations. Um, so while it doesn't necessarily allow us to forecast effectively, because obviously needs change, it does allow us a little bit more flexibility and predictability. And so some method that that organizations can rely on to reliably cover our administrative and indirect costs would be really helpful in a uniform process.
And the last one to call roll is for me, Marianne. And for me, in Lane County, they have a management qualifications form that we fill out that has all the information. It might not have up-to-date insurance for multi-year, but it has all of your information that's on a 990, a W-9. It is the repository of all your nonprofit information or anybody responding to a contract or a grant. And I agree with the budget template that's across the board. And then on the subject that Katrina brought up about the calculation of admin and limitations, it seems like pretty early in this process, if we just said that statewide we were going to accept and ask that all the state agencies were able to accept the OMB guidelines for de minimis and NICR, negotiated direct cost, indirect cost, in the rate, negotiated indirect cost rate. And that would be a huge step up to the full cost recovery.
Thank you, Marianne. And I did see a little note from the chat. Looks like Helen
Hi.
is here.
I am here. I'm going to share what I hope is lower hanging fruit. It's just the same word count on similar questions. So even if I am applying to 4 different agencies, if I know, like, you know, a general question like give us an organizational background has the same word count, then I could copy and paste and not, you know, try to figure out, okay, well, this time is 250 words and this time I have 500. So now how do I make that work?
Oh, I didn't even think about that. That is so simple. You have to have like 6 different versions of your tell us your mission and vision.
Exactly.
Thank you for that, Helen. Anybody else that we missed?
I'm not sure if the state members were called upon, the task force members that are the agency reps, like our DOJ member, myself,
Yeah,
governor's office.
it did feel like we hadn't quite gotten to everybody. So let's see. Where is, now I'm looking for my agenda. Marianne, do you have the copy of the agenda with the full list of the participants on top?
Yes, let me keep going. So we have Debbie Dennis.
Oh, hi. I'm here. I guess the main thing that came to mind for me was things that are already mentioned. So I guess I'll offer something from the state agency perspective, and that perhaps it would be more efficient if all employees who are the collectors and reviewers of grant applications had a common application to look at so that training would be easier, or if employees moved from agency to agency, they wouldn't be learning something new.
Christina Galliano. Sveta.
Present. Sorry to be joining late. I don't know if there's a question or anything else to follow up on, but let me know.
There is a question, and the question is, what is an example of an inefficiency or a redundancy that you would hope could be cured with a recommendation for a uniform application process?
Oh, such a good question. As a data nerd, I think I would probably think about reporting requirements being pretty redundant across multiple agencies and contracts and programs. So I think to the best that we can standardize that process and get folks on the same page in terms of expectations, the more efficient the process can be.
State Representative Charlie Conrad. State Senator Winsvey Campos. Do you want me to go down the list of all the other agency people that are on the list?
Nope, because we're going to hear from all of them in a minute.
Okay.
So I think if anybody else didn't come in late or we didn't catch you, kind of one last opportunity to make sure we get your attendance on the roll call and your check-in question. Okay. Before we jump into public comment, I just wanted to remind folks that you should have seen in the email that you got from Amy. We had used our chat last time to collect follow-up questions, and the agencies have now responded to those follow-up questions, and they are posted on the website. We'll try to do that same thing here again today. So we'll try to use the chat primarily for any follow-up questions. State which agency you want the question to go to and the answers. That way it's easy to just kind of copy and paste those questions at the end of the meeting. So we can do any follow-up needed there. And we are going to go through the State Departments in their presentations. Everyone will have about 15 minutes, and then we'll do a little bit of a look ahead, and we'll look at the agenda again before we wrap up here. But before we get too much further, do we have anybody who is here for public comment? If you are, you can raise your hand. I think that's how we find you in our audience. Not seeing any hands raised for public comment. There was a comment submitted. So again, when you're going back to the website to look at those January follow-up questions, also make sure you're taking a look at the public comments that came in. Okay, we're just breezing right through. So we're going to go through our department presentations, and then we're going to take a break. And then after the break, we're going to come back and DAS is going to do a risk management presentation. We've been actually talking a lot about insurance. And one of the things that we learned in our agenda planning meeting is that DAS actually has a tool and a guideline that they use to help kind of assess when different levels of insurance might be needed, and how some of those pieces are kind of done in the background. And so this is an opportunity for us to kind of peel back the curtain a little bit, learn a little bit more about that practice. And then we'll, at the end, take a look at our topic for March, the questions that we have set up for March, and collect any last minute feedback on that before we're ready to send that off to the agencies to prepare for our March presentation. I do want to acknowledge, I haven't heard from some folks. We're not allowed to talk to each other. I've heard in a roundabout way that some people are feeling like we're getting a lot of information and it's kind of complicated to keep stuff straight. And I want to acknowledge that this is a long period of us just listening. So I totally acknowledge that, and that's very difficult. We're going to try to incorporate a couple of different tools, and we'll talk about that a little bit in our look ahead. But I also definitely want to encourage folks that if you have a way of kind of organizing information that you think will be helpful, to please communicate that with with Amy Amy's out right now, but she will be back because I think she's kind of our repository of information right now. We're really utilizing her to help us kind of continue to collect information from all the task force members, questions from all the departments as we move forward. So I want to make sure that we are making good tools that help people feel like they are learning and understanding, given that we are collecting so much information and listening to so much information. And I want to try to keep encouraging that. I only know how I learn. And so I don't want to assume that everyone learns the way that I do. And there may not be one single tool that we can all use to move this forward, but we can have multiple. And I want to make sure that we do, so that when we get further into our recommendation phase, where we're really kind of saying, so what did we hear and what do we want to turn that into, that folks feel like they've understood enough of the information that's come in and they've gotten their questions answered sufficiently to feel confident making recommendations. And so we'll continue to work on that together. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. We're going to do about 15 minutes per presentation. I will kind of keep a little bit of a clock, but hopefully, again, we'll be able to, may not be able to have a lot of dialogue with the presentations, but please utilize the chat for any follow-up questions that you have. And so we're going to go ahead and invite DAS up first for the uniform application procedures. Again, later they'll be coming back for our risk management presentation, but DAS to you.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Summer, would you mind displaying the presentation? And while she's pulling that up, I will just say DAS's presentation today will be quite brief because we don't collect applications. So we didn't have a lot to share on this process. So anyway, I'll run through our slides, and if you have any questions, please let me know. All right, next slide, Summer. Okay, so just as a reminder, the grants that DAS puts in place are all legislatively designated. So at the end of legislative session, we basically have a list that says, here are the different funding streams, and here are the recipients of the grants that DAS is responsible for issuing. And so we don't have really a reason or methodology for collecting applications because we're just directly instructed on who would be getting the grants. We did put down here our workflow just for informational purposes. So like I said, the funding is designated by the legislature, as is the recipient. We are notified of that. We generate our template agreement. The agreement gets reviewed by the Department of Justice, and then we send out the grant agreement for review and signature. Next slide. We do not have a grants management tracking system at DAS. We just have these are all done by one department out of our Chief Financial Office, and they use Smartsheets and Excel to organize and track their grant data. Like I said, all of our grant agreements do get approved, reviewed and approved by the Department of Justice. The only other sort of little wrinkle here is that for the grants that are tied to lottery revenue bonds, we have those also reviewed by bond counsel. And from time to time, a situation arises where a decision might be made to delay or cancel the issuance of a bond of a grant that's tied to a lottery bond. And that has to do, it's a little bit complicated, but it has to do with the time frames. The money has to be spent within a certain time frame related to those lottery bonds. And so if the entity isn't prepared to receive and execute within the time frame by the lottery bond, then we may have to delay it so that we can extend the time frame for them. Okay, next slide. I'm sorry, it's just a little repetitive, but our grants are just directed to us from the legislature, and we get the list of recipients. We don't have a grant pre-approval process or a grant application for those reasons. Next slide. That's all. Ours was pretty simple. I know other agencies are going to be a lot more detailed than DAS in this particular category.
That was very quick. Thank you very much. I suppose we do have a moment for questions if anyone does have a follow-up question for DAS.
I had no idea you only did those specific 3 funding streams, so I think that's super helpful to understand. So it's DAS and DOJ still always has to approve or review before the agreement goes out? Is that the process you said?
Well, we are DAS, and so we generate for those that we get directed by the legislature to create. We create them, and then yes, we do send them over to our Department of Justice to review. But they're all pretty straightforward. We have a template, and so ours happen to be pretty straightforward.
Are all the grant funds released at the same time, or are they reimbursement?
They are primarily reimbursed at the same time. Well, we execute the grant agreement and then we issue payment. We don't do very much that is reimbursement at DAS.
So does it also mean that any general fund and any all lottery dollars go through DAS? Or is there some that don't go through DAS because they're procured through an agency or department?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
If possible, could we capture that and get back to the task force
Sure.
with the answer to that question? I think that DAS is the only one who issues them under lottery bonds, but I want to double check that.
I had a quick question about your most recent comment that you don't do reimbursements, you just issue a grant payment. From DAS's perspective, for the agencies that do reimbursement only, is it for, what's the reasoning behind it? Is it cash flow cost, or excuse me, is it cash flow issues and just trying to tamper that? Is it a matter of accountability? From DAS's perspective, why are some agencies doing reimbursements only?
That's a hard question for us to answer because we really aren't involved in the processes. I could make an educated guess, and I would say it has to do mostly with accountability. But I think that's actually a question for the agencies that are setting up the grants in that way. It could also have to do with the funding streams that are coming in. So there may be some sort of federal regulations or things like that that sort of restrict the types of payment methodologies they can use.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to know if there was some administrative restrictions in-house that were sort of, for lack of better terms, hamstringing agencies.
Sure, understood. Understood.
Or if there was a different methodology. I appreciate you. Thank you.
Uh-huh. Okay, maybe that's all.
Yeah, I think so. Let that silence hang just for a minute. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you,
And
Debbie.
if a question does pop up for you, if a question does pop up for you, again, feel free to use the chat. Just say, to DAS, this is my question, and we'll collect those as follow-up responses. And then, so number 2 on our list is going to be the Department of Early Learning and Care.
And I don't think that we are going to have a huge presentation. I try to keep things pretty high level. So I'm going to be hopeful that while we will have some more than DAS, because obviously we do have grants, that we can keep this from going over time. I'm working on multiple screens, so I'm going to try and address you directly. And Lori Norline is also here to answer any questions you might have that I can't because we do different roles within our agency. So to start with, your first question was around the agreement process. And this is a fairly detailed flow of what we do. We submit procurement requests. We develop the grant application. And then I think what you're most interested in is the timeline to get it ready. So we get it to DOJ. We have a really good relationship with DOJ. Our turnaround time is usually roughly about 5 days for a review. Then we take it back to our program and in-house folks and revise that application. We try to turn it around within 10 days and get it back to DOJ for another review. That can be some back and forth. So those timelines, those time amounts in this are estimated. It really depends on the complexity of the application. Then we post the opportunity and application and usually have it up for between 30 and 45 days to give folks an opportunity to really determine whether this is an opportunity they want to be part of. Then we close the applications and go through a review for application completeness. And then we move on to scoring, review and scoring. I do have 10 days listed for funding determination. That is also somewhat variable depending on where we're at in knowing the total amount of funding we have available, but typically within 10 business days, we can get that laid out. We allow for a protest period on our grants before we issue final awards, knowing that for some of our grants, there are a lot of people applying and they may have questions or want to know why they weren't able to receive the grant award. We recently put up our awards management system. Currently, it is being used for payment of grant claims. So we also use Smartsheets, Excel, Word documents, other submissions, all for tracking. Our ability to share information from this system is limited because we currently receive the data in a data warehouse format, and there are a few reports we can run from this system. The cloud solution has some flexibility, but again, we are still working to roll out the rest of the system. Eventually, we will be taking these things that are in Smartsheets and Excel and building that reporting and programmatic work into the awards management system. We're also planning to use it to post the opportunities for our grants. So grant decisions at DELC, we draft our project activities, we draft our applications, our agreements, and we make funding decisions. DOJ reviews our agreements for legal sufficiency, as well as our applications to make sure that they align with the agreements we're trying to put out so that we're not having people apply for something and then create an agreement that doesn't really fit what people thought they were applying for. For grants, we primarily rely on DAS for guidance for insurance, and then if there are any IT elements in our agreements for any of those elements. So our grant pre-approval process, in order to be able to, and I was trying to really wrap my mind around what was meant by this question. For an application to be pre-approved by DAS so that we could really have some consistency, we'd need a core template with flexible sections for each program. If we're talking about pre-approving grantees, we would need to have an eligibility screening process, including business documentation and insurance. Now, our award management system will be collecting organization information and have core information on organizations that we are planning to utilize so that information doesn't have to be re-entered every time for existing grantees or previous applicants that are already in the system. They would, however, be able to edit if they needed to. In order to share applications, you could go big and say we'd need a grant management system for all the information, but really you'd need data, agreed upon data for all information. And then organizational role development, which organization is actually going to oversee a lot of the functions of this kind of work. Currently in our agency, in order to do this, we are working on roles and responsibilities. What does procurement do? What do our program folks do? What does our grant fiscal team do within the system and within the application information? Most of it is our procurement folks, but our program and grant folks help develop are helping to develop the core data elements for those applications. Across agencies, we think you'd need standardized data, and I think we've all talked about this already. Some sort of template for data transfer and sharing across those standardized core elements. Another option would be to have all of the organization information centralized in an agency in one place where they could then feed into other application processes. Our authority. Currently, we have the authority needed to manage our grant applications and processes. We have not identified any changes we would need at the moment. However, if there was a shared system, we would definitely have to go back to statute and determine if there were any changes that would be needed, fully dependent upon what it is we're sharing. So it's really hard to really project out what a future state like that could look like without understanding fully the details. A system, in order to share a grant application process, we'd need to develop a system and identify the supports needed for that system in terms of staffing and training, ongoing technical needs. The needs of each agency would need to be analyzed because we all do different work. Even though we work with similar populations, there are details in our work that do need to be kept and nuanced and addressed. But standardized templates could be managed to help facilitate this work and make it easier. We'd also have to learn how to have some shared language because words don't always mean the same agency to agency. And a lot of that's because we work in different, for want of a better term, industries that use the same word differently. And then program information would have to be clarified for the public, for potential grantees, the differences between why you would apply for this particular early learning grant versus this DHS grant, and what is the difference between those two grants? What are the expectations so that grantees could potentially make those differentiations? Also, where do they overlap, and potentially where could we partner to do more holistic grant work would be another area we would need to explore. And that's what I have.
Thank you. Okay, so we have about 6 minutes. And I see that we do have one question. I also had a couple. So let's start with Bettina's question. Can you also comment on your process for a uniform date for continuing reoccurring grants?
I had a spelling, so uniform data for continuing recurring grants, because a lot of grants like Healthy Families and Head Start, they're ongoing, but there is a new contract each biennium. So just really the process for that.
Okay, if I'm understanding the question correctly, you're talking about organizational data, Bettina?
Yes, yeah, organizational data. Yeah.
So we're currently building that process into the awards management system. Our current awards management system, it only has gathered the business data, but as we build applications, we will be collecting insurance documents. We will be collecting other documents in the system so that it's all housed in one centralized location, so that if you have an insurance document in your organization profile, it will be verifiable across all the different grant programs you might have, and procurement can look at one spot and see your insurance.
Correct.
So that's a good example.
So then I had a couple of questions. One, on the first slide, you said we make a procurement request. Who are you making a procurement request to?
Okay, that's a really good piece of clarification. So we initiate a procurement request. We initiate the process with our procurement office. Frequently, the program that oversees the folks that oversee a program and the grant folks are making determinations or decisions about what it is we're going to do in the coming year, or if it's a new grant, trying to put that together so that they can make a procurement request to initiate the procurement process.
Okay, so it's more like creating your list of like, these are the things that we were charged to do this year, kind of trying to make your calendar of
Yeah.
when those are going to, okay, thank you. You said that there was like 30 to 45 days. Why don't you have a single application window?
In part because of timing. When are we launching the application? Which at this point, we get different applications. We get different requests from the legislature to do different projects. And so there are times when the application window is at a time and for an audience that is more likely to have the tools to respond to that application. But for example, Preschool Promise, we have such a range of providers that often we will try to extend that date out to give folks who aren't used to going through the grant application process more time to navigate that process and get support for that process. Yeah.
And then the last one from me was, you mentioned the awards management system, AMS. Is that a specific vendor tool, or was that something that was created just for Delk?
No, it is not. I mean, we call it AMS. It is an off-the-shelf product that's being configured to the things we need, but it is actually DOJ uses a similar version of the system that's been configured for them. Other agencies across the country use this system. Our vendor Agate works with this IGX system. So it is being modified to our specifications, but the core functions of it are set.
That's
So
helpful. Thank
AMS
you.
right now.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering if it's something that's going to buy.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Marian.
So Teresa, AMS replaced what you was used for putting in the reimbursement draws.
As Delk became an agency, we were not able to access the system that we were using at education, the EGM system. So we had to find a system ourselves to be able to navigate that claiming and payment process. And during that, we decided to go beyond that and really look at what we could do to manage grants across our agency.
So I know you do Preschool Promise. What other types of grants do you do?
We have Oregon Pre-Kindergarten, Relief Nurseries, Healthy Families, Baby Promise. We grant to CCR&Rs, Child Care Resource and Referral Offices. The money that goes to Early Learning Hubs goes out in the form of a grant. And then we're also currently working on granting for suspension expulsion prevention program work. There's more, but that's kind of the really fast what I could think of off the top of my head.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And then Danesh, it looks like maybe you've gotten your questions answered in real time in the chat. Any other clarification you needed there?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
This is why it's great to have a partner in this.
All right. Anybody else? 50 more seconds on this 15 minutes. Okay, thank you. That was very informative. Really appreciate it. I loved your workflow grid too. That was really helpful.
Thank you. I look forward to hearing everyone else.
And next up, we have Department of Human Services.
Good morning. My name is Kirk Rhodes, and I'm the administrator for the Shared Services Office of Contracts and Procurement. And bear with me a moment as I share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Looks good.
So in looking at the business of granting, we have got, well, we'll go through the different components of what we would consider impactful on the granting process. Generally speaking, procurement, i.e. Contracts or granting, follow a similar process. And it's really broken down into what comes from the DAS procurement manual. And that's plan, procure, administer, and close out. And this is very helpful in general terms. The specifics of this may change a bit depending on what the need is and the program need and what needs to be done in that process. So basically, this is, from identify the need all the way to, close out and lessons learned. These are general steps. The way that we approach granting is really kind of laid out in this logic model. We've got in the upper left-hand corner program processes, the contract office processes, grant administration, and the consideration activities that go on in between. And from the start of the process, typically a grant comes in as if the agency receives a federal grant of sorts or Casey Foundation or whatever the grantor is, whoever they are. This is discussed in the program, the funding requirements, reporting requirements, and notice of grant awards all considered. We do very little general fund granting, very little. But when that comes in, typically there'll be some sort of budgetary note associated with that that has to be considered. If there's any sort of reporting requirement within our agencies, reporting, i.e., distribution, source of funds, that kind of thing. If there's any sort of guidance there, that would be considered this formative stage here. The application, once the timing and the overall needs and markets are assessed, the application will be requested through the Contracts and Procurement Office, and that will come in on what we call 118. There's, as everyone knows here, there are specific requirements with grant reporting that need to be taken into consideration. All of that is whatever needs to be rolled into the agreement itself will be considered at this stage. And one of the most important things I think that the procurement folks do is to ensure that the relevant terms and conditions from the federal award, notice of award, are incorporated in the document so that we have a working artifact of how that grant would be administered. The grant administration part of this process is really done by our programs. So we have between ODHS and OHA over 200 programs. And so the administration of that's very much decentralized. Reporting is very much decentralized, although the Office of Financial Services, who has a grant accounting office within the office itself, are involved in some of these activities. Really, that is pretty much. So in timelines, they're going to vary quite a bit because depending on the deadlines associated with the monies coming in, federal monies coming in, depending on the complexity of the grant itself or the urgency, it can vary from the program side. It can vary as much from 1 to 6 months. And it would not be an average. This would be a median because it'd be a non-normal distribution as we look at this. Once the contracting office gets the request, We really look at about 45 days to get that out the door and executed. So if there's a solicitation, for instance, one of the things we want to consider is the market, and in going out and doing outreach at the leading edge can be very much can add to the time. But we've heard from many of our partners in the nonprofit world that some of the smaller nonprofits have struggled with proposing, and more time is something we believe can aid to that process and attenuate that process for small nonprofits. We do that also with our contracts as well. So, and this is something that we're very excited about standing up. We've just stood up an outreach, well, more of a centralized outreach, whereas there is some outreach going on in our districts and branches, but we have more of a centralized. We have folks that have been hired and designated to do this. So this makes it easier for the agencies to be able to work with rural areas, historically disadvantaged businesses and throughout Oregon. The outreach part is really what ties things together. Anyway, so the point is that can add to the process depending on what's the need. Grant management system. We really don't have a grant management system. There are some program-centric systems. We have of course, with Oregon Buys, we use it as the other major agencies do, but we've asked for a customized column where some of the grant information can be tracked. However, we believe that a centralized system with regards to the interest of this task force are much more advantageous and would lend themselves, a centralized system would lend itself to much more of what we're asking to accomplish and believe needs to be accomplished. So what decisions are made? Really, there's a myriad of decisions beginning, from when the notice of award hits the Office of Financial Services, and the programs begin discussing with amongst himself on how, and the private sector, on how this would need to be set up. DOJ has purview for legal sufficiency at $250K just raised. The agency itself would decide on the language needed, that which is not covered in the notice of grant award as required T's and C's. The agency will also, in a grant, some grants will say defer to your state procurement code. And so it can be issued as a contract. And really what the agency has to decide at that juncture is would there be a need to be substantial involvement by the agency? Because if the agency was needed in that capacity, it's probably a contract by virtue of the basic use of a grant vice a contract. So the agency will look at the need for substantial involvement or not, ownership, if there's any sort of product that is as a result of this relationship, then the agency would need to consider a contract vice a grant, and review of funding source documentation to determine contracting implications. So some federal grants, there's great latitude as to how the state can treat it. Others, not so much. What would it take to have a grant pre-approval process? Some of the things that have been mentioned this morning are very, I think, spot on. I think that managing the pre-approval, the grant financing, all of it, if it could be managed centrally, would be an extraordinary leap for the state. The idea of our vendors, nonprofits, not having to go through different hoops, so to speak, in applying with different agencies, and almost all agencies have different processes. So a centralized pre-approval process would have to be discussed and vetted, but I think it would reduce cycle times. I think it would reduce confusion, and everyone wins in a scenario where you have this set up centrally. What would it take to share? I mean, again, we're talking about a centralized data source and workflow management system. This is big advantages. I mean, in the same way that contracts being centrally managed in Oregon buys is advantageous to the state, be it for accounting. Although, there are some things that aren't in Oregon buys currently, such as spots purchases, which is an enormous expenditure. But the idea of being able to understand spend, from a sourcing standpoint, and some of the accounting advantages are just, you just can't, you can't argue it. There's no downside, there's no con to it at all. Differentiate between your agency's authority over grant applications, policies, practices, administrative rule, and changes it would need to be. Again, the centralized, well, I would just say this. I don't know of any two agencies that have similar policies about grants. I mean, there's very little in the code. There's some in the code. And there's best practices. And I think what agencies have done is, out of necessity, have, sought systems that were synchronizing well with their market and their stakeholders. However, a centralized system with specific business sectors, so to speak, compartmentalized and preset, would be fantastic. I think it eliminated a lot of rework from both the field and our stakeholders and the agencies. And as mentioned earlier, as grant managers or grant writers specifically, and procurement folks who in many agencies handle the grants, the procurement, the PCS series handle grants, would have, they could easily enculturate and learn the system that's being used in, around state. So they're not having to learn a brand new system. Again, the application process could be centralized, it could be monitored, it could be controlled. That is efficiencies. Again, when one agency achieves an efficiency in some sort of a procedural process, that's fine. It's fine for that agency. However, if we're able to leverage that to state, there's much more of a benefit to everyone in the community and in government. I think that efficiencies that are centralized are just they're much easier to manage and much easier to measure. So we're talking about cycle times, that kind of stuff. It can all be looked at as a glance. I mean, that's as good as it gets, right? Questions?
So unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time for questions on this one. I'm not seeing anything in the chat right away, but if you do have a question, or a question comes up for you on this presentation, please do add that question to the chat. And thank you so much for that. Really appreciating you calling out where there are different benefits and opportunities for a more centralized system.
Most welcome.
Thank you. So the next one is going to be the Oregon Health Authority. Marianne, did you have a question for Department of Human Services?
No, I had a comment. So in my chat, it says chat is only available during the meeting and I'm not allowed to put anything in there. I'm wondering if anybody else is having that problem.
That happened to me the last 2 meetings. Sometimes it helps to sign out and clear your cache and try to sign back in. But this time I had no issues and I don't know why. So I'm sorry about that. It's frustrating.
I will try that.
Okay, so if you are having trouble, if you do have follow-up questions and you're having trouble adding them to the chat, Debbie, do you have a recommendation on maybe who folks can maybe send an email to? Because I know Amy's out.
Yeah, why don't they go ahead and send it to Summer Warner? She's on the line here. And Summer, would you mind dropping your email into the chat?
Thank you so much, Summer, for helping us to catch some of those. So if you're having trouble using the chat for your follow-up questions, please reach out to Summer and send her your follow-up questions so that we can capture those. All right. So let's go ahead and move on to Oregon Health Authority.
You're muted.
It looks like I'm having some issues sharing my screen. It says it's presenting, but it's not showing up in Teams.
We actually can see it.
Can you? Okay, it's
Yeah,
not showing
we
up
can
in
see
my
it.
Teams for some reason. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Okay. Starting over. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Melissa Hanks, Oregon Health Authority. She, her pronouns. I work in the director's office for Chris Couts, the deputy director. I'm here today presenting on behalf of the fantastic experts at the Oregon Health Authority who are doing grants work. I've collected the responses from them and made this presentation. So if you have any questions about like really specific things, I do have some folks who are on the call today who can help answer those questions. The first thing I will say is that we, OHA and DHS share OC&P, and so everything that Kirk just talked about also applies to OHA. So I'm not going to repeat the same information. What I'm going to try to do for you is really focus on the awesome work going on, not only across our agency in programs, but really specifically in public health and our community engagement team. That is kind of the cutting edge of where public health modernization has been happening in this respect. And so I know that Dolly England and her team have done some fantastic work in this area, and we'll talk about that as we go ahead. All right. So as Kirk mentioned, OHA has more than one process for grant applications and management. It really depends on the program about how they're going to do that. We have standard grant processes throughout through the Office of Contracts and Procurement. We try to use those. They do a great job in training us about how we should be doing those. We do have unique processes in the divisions and programs. It really depends on the funding source, the type of organizations we're working with, and the types of grant activities. Again, it really does vary by the program. We follow the DAS procurement life cycle. You've seen this before. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. That is pretty much how we do this, and we try to get this done within a certain time frame to make sure that those funds do get out on time. So let me just get right to the general high-level timeline for our community engagement team grants in PhD. It takes, in general, about 8 to 10 months for a full start to finish workflow. That starts with the 118 solicitation request that Kirk mentioned previously, and the endpoint is the distribution of awards. So you can see most of this work takes place in the planning and development phase. Releasing it takes about 6 to 8 weeks. A month to review applications and make selections. about a month to a month and a half to develop the contracting package, another month to month and a half to do the contract routing, and then a month for the payment process. So longest possible 10 months to distribute that payment from doing the 118 form. All right. Most grants at OHA are managed independently by the program staff. They just use basic office software like Excel, Access, Smartsheet, or SharePoint. They also use software like SurveyMonkey and GroupSite to do customer relations management with their grantees. The Public Health Division notably uses the .NET system that was created in-house to manage grants for the local public health authorities and the tribes. It is generally going to be easier to modify or share the information in those basic office software. It may be a little more challenging to modify or export information coming out of these systems that the individual programs are using to manage their grants. So a little bit more about the .NET system, and this really is something that the agency is quite proud of and the employees are quite proud of. The .NET system is a way for public health to manage awards by program element, and it is a web-based system that they can all access. The system capabilities include built-in workflows from initiation to approval. It tracks the program element contract awards. It tracks the award amendments, the program element payments, helps manage the grantees administratively. It generates contract reports and generates payment reports. The limitations mainly that it doesn't track the actual expenditures of the grant. It generally just tracks payouts, and it doesn't allow for an analysis of those program element areas or by fund sources. So it's really for managing them. There's not a lot of analytical capability on the back end of that system. Grant decisions that we have to have reviewed by DAS or DOJ. So OHA falls under administrative rule of procurement and legal sufficiency review by DOJ. We refer to DOJ for decisions like grant templates. They pertain to the RFG and the process in which they're done. Both of these agreements are subject to DOJ review for legal sufficiency under ORS 291.047. It's up to the program director to approve and confirm the funds, and other decisions are really up to the parameters of the funding source, and DAS gets involved if the funding source comes from state legislation. What would it take to have a grant pre-approval process? Really, the feedback that we got here was about opt-in. Having funding opportunities that include an option for eligible organizations to opt in to receive funding announcements so that they can support future and emergent public health priorities, kind of developing this base of community-based organizations that we would have ongoing grant pre-approval with, and so they would opt in to participate in that process. It would require resources that could support things like a statewide enterprise level system, standardized pre-qualification requirements, and flexible grant agreement templates. They would have to be standardized, but we would have to define where we could flex that to meet the needs of the organization. What would it take to be able to share grant application information between programs within our agency and with other agencies? We would need a shared central repository and database. I know you've heard that before this morning. We would need technology that's available across the agencies. We need it to be paid for by the state, and it would need a staff of its own to manage that technology and then teach all the other state agencies how to use it. We would also, and this is really important to call out, we would need to have shared values and a commitment to the community about how we were going to engage that through a shared program or a shared system. Our agencies center equity and community in really different ways based on the priorities and the services of those agencies. And so we'd want to make sure that we were identifying what those shared values were and that we got buy-in and commitment from the community to make this possible. We really think that this could be accomplished with an existing central repository, something like Oregon Buys that was modified with some additional considerations. We would need the complete end-to-end process, and to be standardized across end users, it would need to include planning, development, solicitation, managing all those grants and contracts, the funding, the finances, and the risk management, which we're going to hear from DAS about a little bit later. Really, this is about finding areas that we have in common with other agencies that we can have in a central system. The authority that we have over policies and practices versus legislative changes, Really, we need the legislature to decide on things like improvements to the acquisition of project resources to make these grants happen, things like position authority to allow for more timely building of resource capacity. It's really people that are driving this on the back end. And so we need people that are consistent across this program to keep this moving forward. We need to address the barrier also of funding end dates by building bridge periods across biennia. When the biennium ends, so does our funding for grants. And we need a way to commit to funding cycles for the community that outlast legislative sessions. This also creates a tremendous amount of administrative burden when we have to redo everything when the funding ends. And if we could have longer term funding plans, that would help reduce our workload quite a bit. To have a shared grant application process, it's only going to work for some overlapping programs and funding sources across agencies. It's going to help align the funding and connect the grant application to a single funding source. So if we, for example, had a shared federal grant source that had similar requirements, we could build things around that. Something that was a really great idea. We could identify and allocate a social determinants of health general fund that we could use on community specific work regardless of agency that would help address any kind of social determinant of health and make a shared process around a funding stream for everybody to apply for. We also really want to recognize that each agency and really each program has a really specific need, and their grant system is really based on their deliverables and their funding. And so it may be really hard to achieve that shared grant application for all agencies. We would all have to work together quite a bit to make that shared process. We can definitely gather best practices, but ultimately there are certain kinds of funding and types of deliverables that require very separate, unique processes specific to management and tracking of funds. All right, any questions?
So we have about 5 minutes and we do have a few questions. I posted a couple. One was for that list of elements that DOJ has to review that you had. Do they do that all at once? Like, do you send them all of your templates and they do that before you kind of open up to applications? Or do they do it piece by piece, kind of following the timeline?
That is a question I'm going to refer to Dolly. Dolly, could you please talk about that?
Hi, good morning. Dolly England here, She, Her Queen. I'm the Community Engagement Program Manager for the Public Health Division. I'm going to tell you what I know. And I think the answer is, for us, it's really about that boilerplate contract language. And we might go back and forth to make sure that that is correct between OCMP and DOJ. But it is also why it's written pretty broadly so that we can go back and make amendments as necessary. But I don't honestly know if there are other parts that DOJ is reviewing outside of that or in a different timeline. The contract boilerplate is the very big thing that tends to go back and forth between all of the agencies. So I'm sorry I don't have more information. I don't know if anyone from DOJ is on the line and might have more information about that.
This is Kirk. I would add to what Dolly has said, and that's a little of both. Along the way, it's always best practice to consult with and work with DOJ in development of an agreement of any kind. However, legal sufficiency review is an event that kind of culminates at the end of the process, and our aspiration is to be as close to the mark moving to that point, having done the engagement along the way and successfully pass through at the end. So yeah, it's a little of both. Thank you.
And when you say the end, is that when you already have an awardee that's been notified, or is the end before you put it out for application?
No, that is even before the award is granted. This is just putting together the RFGA or the agreement itself. it's reviewed and approved ultimately in that event, called legal sufficiency review at the end of the process. So before the RFGA is awarded, that would be approved and reviewed by DOJ, and then subsequent awards that exceed threshold as well. So it's really our DOJ has been, and the folks we work with in business transactions have been fantastic on getting things turned around and collaborating up to that point.
Thank you. One more question, and then we'll see what else we've got here. Same sort of question from Del. You had a range of time for when the applications are open. Why don't you use a standard open period?
This is Dolly. I'm happy to help answer that question. I think this is very hard, and it again varies from organization to organization. Within OHA, for the public health division and the community engagement team, we leave the grant open for a solid 6 weeks. And we do that because our community partners told us that we needed to keep it open. So I agree that having a standard amount of time would be great. And we've heard from community that it needs to be more time rather than less time.
Yeah, so I saw that on the PowerPoint, it actually said 6 to 8 weeks. So when do you decide to do more than 6?
6 has been our bottom, if you will. Like at minimum, we're going to do 6. But I think it's also important to note that as part of that 6-week time period, we're doing at least 2 technical assistance sessions where community can come into a Zoom space and ask questions about their application, so that they're getting the technical assistance to submit, feeling confident about their application. So that we've created that as part of our grant process as well. And I can only speak to the public health division.
Yeah, and I think that that's totally fine. I mean, some of this is also just understanding what the agencies are capable of. We know it's varying across the agencies themselves, so it's good to kind of get that sense. And I just want to make sure I understand that. So the technical assistance happens during the time at which organizations are putting their applications together. So it's not like they get that technical assistance and then the clock starts. The clock starts before they've gotten any technical assistance, and then includes the technical assistance time. Is that right?
Correct. And it's partially because we realized that folks needed to like fill out the application and be in it and know what their questions were and what technical assistance they needed.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so that's time, and it looks like we do have a follow-up question in the chat, so we'll capture that for follow-up in writing. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you, everyone.
And then, thank you. Next up, the Higher Ed Coordinating Commission.
Hi, my name is Derek, and I'm going to hit present in Teams and hope this works. Let's see. Think it's working. Can anyone see my screen?
It's almost loaded. Yes.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. So thank you for giving us time today. I am Derek Disney, the procurement manager from the Higher Education Coordinating Commission. And responding to those follow-up questions that you all had. It's not late. Here we go. Okay. So for our agency workflow, I just want to first acknowledge that procurement is one part of the full spectrum of the life cycle. There's so much work that our programs do on the front end before I even see it or my team sees it, including gathering information for how best to put requirements into requests for grant applications. How are they going to best manifest the intent of the legislation for the funding that we get, how are we going to best utilize the federal funds that we get for the intended purposes. And I just want to acknowledge that and sit on that for a second, because that is so much work that they do, and they do such a good job of surveying the landscape of the industry, sometimes seeking feedback from industry consortia, and really lean into that well before it even hits my desk. So thank you, programs, for doing that. And then once it comes to me, what happens is a program director or deputy director will submit what we call a procurement request. And it's basically, hey, we have this money. We need to do either a direct grant award, which is very rare for us because in our process, we borrow the concepts from the public procurement code. So anything that is $10,000 or below, we could direct award, but that is very rare because a lot of the legislation that we get or federal funds that we get are well above that threshold. And so we do a competitive process for transparency and fairness. So usually when I get that procurement request form, it's for drafting the document requesting grant applications for us to evaluate our team and the procurement team to make award decisions, and then for the procurement team to actually write the grant agreement. Mercedes, do you want me to answer that question now or wait? Okay, I'll wait towards the end. So the rules for DOJ legal sufficiency review, I'm just touching it because it's on the slide, used to be you didn't necessarily have to submit a request for applications document to Department of Justice for a legal sufficiency review. That changed as of January 1st. Now we have to, but HEC was already doing it before for many years. So we were already we were ahead of others in doing that. So we do have to submit those when the cumulative opportunity is over $250,000 now. It used to be $150,000, and then that got temporarily bumped up to $250,000 and then made permanent as of January 1st. So once the opportunity is open, and that time period can vary, just like my predecessors that presented stated, we really make that variable dependent on the complexity, especially the complexity of the application. Some of our funding is only eligible for community colleges or universities to submit applications for. And within that, if it's a uniform amount that they're eligible for, like it's not variable and actually like a true competitive process, we just need information from them because the legislation requires that, then we keep it very simple. It's almost like what we call a letter of intent. It's basically they're just responding to very kind of basic surface level responses. And if they do that, they get the money that the legislation says they can have. But in other areas, in most often the case, it is competitive. So it can vary. Like awards can range from $20,000 up to $1 million or more. And so we do think about that very intentionally about how much time does the applicant need to put this together. And so kind of our bare minimum for when it's a variable potential award amount is usually 30 days. And we often do longer than that just to buy applicants more time. It's a process to respond to these questions and provide substantive answers to us, what they intend to do with these funds if awarded. And so we try to give them as much time as we can tolerate. Right. And I think my colleagues addressed kind of the same process of what happened once we receive grant applications. Our evaluation committee, which can be dozens of people or a small subset, sometimes representative from the community as well if they didn't submit an application, they score based on the criteria that were set in the request for applications, make suggestions for award decisions. The program director for that respective program, signs off on those recommendations or adjusts them. And then we issue a notice of conditional award. We do not, unlike other agencies, which I was kind of surprised to hear that others offer opportunity to protest. We do not do that. As far as I know, we've never done that for grant opportunities. One, because it would delay the process. Secondly, we are very communicative with those that are successful and unsuccessful for how they could improve for next time. And some of our programs have recently implemented the use of contracted technical assistance providers. So those that can facilitate someone to help write a grant application. They provide feedback. They coach them on their answers. Like, here's what the document says. You didn't really respond to question 2. Really, flesh that out and get better at that. And we've also paid those third-party contractors especially for those that are unsuccessful, to really coach them using feedback from our evaluation committee to help them for next time. And that's kind of a new thing for us, something that hiring third-party contractors to provide that technical assistance is great because it removes us from, giving, helping them for an application that we're then reviewing, right? So it removes us from that process, but also helps them get a better application to submit. So we don't do an award protest once we've issued the notice of conditional award. We will reach out to those awardees and say, hey, we're working on the grant agreement now. Give us a week or 2 to get a draft to you. And then we use a grant template depending on if it's a community college, university, or a community-based organization. And that's pretty standardized boilerplate language. The thing that changes very often is the project activities, and that varies, even within the same request for applications document or response, a wide spectrum of project activities. So that's where we have to really get into the meat of, is this adequate? If it's above the $250,000 threshold, is it legally sufficient? We work with Department of Justice on that, and then we send over to the awardee the the intended agreement to be signed and executed. So I'll get to those questions at the end. I want to keep trudging along.
Don't let them distract you.
Yeah.
We're just trying to remember them.
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So as far as a system for managing grants, the programs use a variety of tools. I don't want to say it's the Wild Wild West, but it's kind of the Wild Wild West. They use a variety of tools that work best for them. And I wish we had a more uniform system, but I can't necessarily require that. So our more sophisticated programs, like our Future Ready team, uses much more sophisticated tools than their counterpart programs. They use for the application, for applicants to submit an application, they began using a program called SurveyMonkey Apply. So it's a web-based application program. The rest of the programs, well, I shouldn't say the rest, there are 2 others that utilize that as well. But the others, we rely on the kind of archaic method of email. So they have to submit a completed application to a particular email, whether that's someone from the procurement team or just a centralized email inbox for procurement. I think the web-based application is the way of the future, and I really like what we've done with that. It helps our team too know how much interest is there, because they can see how many people have started an application. They can see who's completed those applications because they've hit submit. And it allows applicants to save their work as they go as well. They can pause, come back to it later, days later. And they can also see how many people started an application but never submitted it in time. And so that I think provides a lot more information to our team than the old standard of email application. So that's a really wonderful tool that they utilize. They also use Basecamp, which is a web-based program to communicate with applicants. Well, I shouldn't say applicants, with awarded grantees, get those communications. Otherwise, the other programs generally use just email, Outlook. As far as procurement's part, we just use a glorified Excel sheet. I wish we had a more sophisticated program, particularly to find efficiencies in how we can do our process. In preparing for this presentation, I dove deep into our data in our Excel sheet and had to utilize some subject matter experts to kind of tease some data out of it. And I found that bear in mind, we only started tracking duration of procurement's work from the procurement request to executed agreement. We only started tracking that as of July 1st. So bearing in mind, I only have 6 months, 7 months of data for the request for applications that we've issued, including contract opportunities, so requests for proposals. Our general timeline for that is on average 45 days. And then on the other side, what comes out of that, either a contract or a grant opportunity, that also coincidentally takes an average of 45 days. Those are not the ideal timelines that I want. I want to shorten that, but it's good to know where we're starting from. So, I can help kind of manage our program's expectations and do better. Losing, cumulatively 90 days is not where we want to be. We want to do better. Our financial side, it's interesting that Delk has a program by which they can issue payment. I find that really intriguing. I think we presently are in the position of, for a contract opportunity, if a vendor is not willing to take the state's procurement card, we call it a spots card. Across the board, it's called spots card. If they can't take a spots card payment, then for a contract, we have to put it into the state's procurement system called Oregon Buys. And our fiscal team has to go in there and trigger payment through the SFMA, which is the fiscal system. And if the vendor is set up for direct deposit, it would initiate that direct deposit transfer. If they're not, it would trigger a snail mail check. Now, as far as grants go, we do not put any grant opportunities or executed grant agreements into Oregon Buys. It was made pretty clear to us, and I think a lot of other agencies, that Oregon Buys it wasn't intended for grants. Contracts, yes, not grants. So on the grant side, we still process invoices and kind of the approval process for that, back and forth with our fiscal team and program over email, and then our team will initiate payment through SFMA. They'll just trigger it, whether they're set up for direct deposit or getting a check. We have pretty wide latitude for decision authority for our grant agreements. We developed over time the grant agreement templates with Department of Justice, but those are, those boilerplate provisions are always kind of subject to negotiation. For example, intellectual property is one that comes up from time to time. Insurance requirements, DAS risk management has total discretion over us for contracts. But for grants, truth be told, we didn't require insurance for grantees for a long time. And we discovered that our counterpart agencies were. And so we're like, oh, well, we should probably fall in line with that. So We started implementing that probably about a year ago, maybe a little bit longer. And while we have more discretion now to waive or modify insurance requirements, we have worked very closely with DAS risk management to really know what's acceptable risk and what's not. But ultimately, that decision rests with HEC and more specifically our programs at the direction of our executive leadership. One cool thing that we've started doing is tracking those decisions that we made regarding insurance provisions, waivers, or modifications, and so that we don't have to hit our heads against the wall when that question comes up again, or search for hours through email or whatnot. So that's a handy tool that we've started to develop. Do note that anything over $250,000 in value, whether it's a contract or grant opportunity, if we do have to seek legal sufficiency approval if in negotiations with the grantee they want to modify provisions from what DOJ approved for legal sufficiency. We do have to go back to them and say, hey, this changed. Are you okay with that or not? If not, tell us the risks and we'll work on that. That. And then I was a little confused about this question. I wasn't sure if you meant pre-approval for grantees without the competitive process that we do, or you meant grantee or applicants would be pre-approved for insurance requirements already in the system award management system for federal funds. I wasn't sure what that was, so I try to answer both. I don't see a scenario in which case we would not do a competitive process for cumulative funds over $10,000, just because of the transparency and fairness. I think it would be kind of ripe for abuse otherwise. As far as the pre-approval process for an applicant being registered with Secretary of State in the federal system, if there are federal dollars involved, that is something we could do. And I think we internally are trying to address that. So we've created central repositories, central files for programs to access that accumulate certificates of insurance, the SAM.gov registry that we check on every year now, and Secretary of State registry, so that we don't have to ask our applicants for that when it gets time to drafting the grant agreement. So we've started that. It would be nice to be able to share that with other agencies as well. And my colleagues talked about that in their respective presentations, so I won't beat a dead horse. So we, as the others stated, we need a shared file location. The only additional information that my other colleagues didn't really get into is that if there is sensitive data within that, like financial documents or financial information about our potential applicants, we would definitely want it to be very secure, right? So that is pretty instrumental. And then regarding a centralized grant management system, I await the day that happens. I would really want to support that, as my colleagues before me have done. The one thing that they didn't mention is that, first of all, DAS procurement has oversight over many state agencies, but not all agencies. And so any legislation or legislative directive that would fund and require a grant management system, just be careful in that you're getting everybody, because you don't want, a couple stragglers that have independent procurement authority to not be using that system. So find a way to either carrot or stick to make that a requirement for everybody, not just those under DAS authority. Secondly, with that, the funding source matters a lot, because, for example, we had funds that that were tied to state funds, and we had a very limited period of time to purchase a grant management system, and we were trying to purchase that, but the the process, especially with an IT solution, IT investment, takes longer than you think. So if you are going to give, let's say, DAS funds to purchase a grant management system on behalf of all agencies and then require the others that aren't under their authority to utilize it, using state funds to do that is for the initial purchase is I fear it wouldn't happen in time because there's so many hurdles to get through for that process and to find a good solution, right? You don't want to be in a pinch where you're in a time crunch and just go with the easy one that actually doesn't do what you want it to do. So federal funds, I think, can open that door for a longer period of time for that initial purchase, and then flip it over to state funding to continue to support that system. That's just my suggestion.
So we're at about time, but I can see you have maybe another slide or two. If you could wrap up.
Yeah, I think I've covered this, or my colleagues have covered this, so I don't need to address our authority over that. And I think my colleagues and what I just stated address this. So happy to answer those questions that came up. So let's see, I'll look through.
We actually don't have a ton of time for questions on this one,
okay.
but any questions that we do have in the chat will definitely be sent to you for an opportunity for some written follow-up. Really appreciate the presentation. I gotta say, we're almost, I think we have 3 more folks left, but just seeing the range of tools that folks are working with, this is really informative. So thank you everybody for taking the time to put these together. Next up, we have the Department of Education.
Hi, good morning. I don't believe my colleague Ian has the opportunity to share the slide deck. If someone can give him the rights to share, that would be helpful.
Ian should be able to share
Is that
now.
something you're able to do? Yeah, there we go.
Great, thank you so much. Also, I want to know, I can't see anything in the chat, so if questions come up in the chat, I don't see them. So please just let me know. I'm not ignoring you, I just don't see them. So just to let you know, my name is Kai Turner. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of the Office of Finance and Information Technology at the Oregon Department of Education. Next slide, Ian. So I wanted to just give you a very high level overview in 4 steps of what our grant application workflow looks like. We have a more detailed summary as a part of this slide that you can go to, but I just didn't want to create multiple slides around every little intricacy related to our grant application workflow. So, the first step is identifying those funding streams, especially if it's a new program, and any of the additional rulemaking that might likely come along with any new money from the legislature, as well as any consultation with community or our tribal partners. When we receive that notice, our teams are very good at the program level of going out and working with different community level partners to start talking about what's going to come through with this level of granting. And then they start drafting a plan around how they're going to distribute those funds and creating the RFA based on some of the community feedback. The second step in that is more of the internal process around how we do grants. So when I speak about setting up the grants in the system, we are speaking to our grant management system, aptly known as EGMS, Electronic Grant Management System. We have to set up the indexes, create those profiles in that system. So when we do create the executable contracts, our grantees can go in and start asking for the reimbursement based on the program activities within that agreement. The next step in that process is the release and review of those particular items. So we're talking about preparation of the agreements, determining the evaluation stage, crafting the RFA for release, and then planning around that. including award, right? And then step 4 is that submission in the e-approvals process with us internally. As we start doing that, that's that Form B process. It's internal jargon around the particular form that our program staff submit to then make it all the way through our approval process, so then it can be posted. And we accept our competitive RFAs. Next slide, Ian. So this is a breakdown of our timelines. You've seen my colleagues that have gone before us. It typically takes us about 3 weeks to draft the RFA with the program. We recommend that we keep the solicitation or RFA open for 30 days. It can remain open longer, but our standard is 30 days. Typically, that's 1 to 3 weeks for the evaluation, and then 2 weeks for the intent to award, and then up to 30 days for the back and forth conversations and negotiation around the contract and the agreement. And then we go through the process with DOJ for approval on any changes to the contract agreement. And then we go to the signature process. So in total, it can take us somewhere between 40 weeks to 25 weeks, depending on the type of funding. Now, I want to share this, and I believe I shared it the last time I did a presentation. We have upwards of 10,000 contracts in a biennia in ODE, so that is quite a bit of work. So that leads into sometimes having longer lead times or completion times around getting any one body of work or grant program closed out and executed. Next slide, Ian. So I believe I shared in our last conversation and presentation that we have a grant management system, EGMS. It is 20 years old. We are in the throes of awarding a new system for awards management. This current system that we have is not an application system. It is simply our financial system to draw down the funds. There are no uploads to it. There is no interconnectivity between whatever procurement system we're using, be that Oregon Buys as the posting spot, SurveyMonkey Apply, or any of the not district sites, I apologize, any of the program sites that also notify folks how to apply. The funding mechanisms in EGMS and all the reports are downloaded or extracted by way of Excel, and the reporting is hard-coded into the system. We are working towards replacing the EGM system, as I stated earlier, with an implementation in 2025. But we are still in the process of negotiating that contract. Next slide, Ian. So I won't go over what many of my colleagues already shared, but DAS doesn't have any involvement in our grants. That is outside of their purview. DOJ does require us to go through legal sufficiency. I would say that because of the complexity of our agreements, sometimes our agreements have braided funds in them, be that from federal and state. It can often make it harder for our agreements to get through the DOJ process. So we look at 3 to 6 months because of the number of agreements we have. I would also say that we try to our best ability to craft templated documents to make this more efficient when we are working with different grantees. We also understand that we do have a large volume of contracts that go through, and we have a large volume of grants. So our partners at DOJ might not have the full capacity at any one given moment to take on all the agreements that we could be sending over to them at any given moment. But we do recognize that DOJ is actively looking for additional support and capacity for ODE because of the volume. 10,000 contracts is excessive. Next slide, Ian. So pre-approvals, I would say, I'm just going to jump down to bullet point 3 or number 3. There could be opportunities in which there isn't a pre-approval, in air quotes. I think some of those things are definitely around making sure that our CBO partners are seeking funding, have the right assurances and insurance up front. there are certain things, as I stated before in my last presentation, that we have to have, including the right insurance because of the population that we work with, kids. So that is often what we need, and we defer to DAS risk management on the appropriate level, given the populations that we work with. But I think that is one of those key areas. I think my colleagues pointed out other spaces in which there could be a pre-approval process, and I could agree with many of them. The tough part for us is that largely ODE funnels money to districts. So when we think of pre-approval, I think of spaces in which I can get dollars to the districts in easier ways, because that is the largest book of business we have when it comes to getting dollars out the door in service of families and kids. Next slide, Ian. Shared grant application. I think a couple of my colleagues touched on this earlier. There's just so much difference between what all of us do on this call, from HEC to ODE to OHA to DHS. And typically, I don't think what was shared here is if something was to happen in one of our wheelhouses, we do create agreements in which we transfer the money and the grant over to that agency, and then they distribute the money because it feels like it aligns better within their wheelhouse. There are agreements that happen interagency for disbursement of grants in those ways. I think a modern grant system could be achieved if it was clearly outlined. I also agree with, I believe it was Derek at HEC that said Oregon Buys is likely not the right system to take grants and was not necessarily designed for that. But something similar to that could work and could present an opportunity to pull reports. It's just that we all ask different questions pursuant to the dollars that we're funneling out, and it means something different to each of us. And I don't know that a common grant application in itself would be the best way to do that. But I think there are spaces in which we can share information like W-9s, et cetera, between agencies. Next slide, Ian. This is just one example of how it could be tedious to create a shared grant application process. Largely, I point back to districts because that's who we work with the most. But these things can become insurmountable with the amount of questions that we would have to ask to create that common grant application process. So if OHA had a set of questions for their funding pot, and then ODE had a set of questions, and it was a single application, it would likely create its own barriers for CBOs and partners to understand which application they're applying to and how much information they need to give in that space. So with that, Ian, next slide, I believe it is questions. ODE authority and changes. There we have it. I apologize. So we have the authority to expend money as appropriated to ODE. It is within our statutes. Based on the line items and programs designated to us. There has been an effort from the legislature for us to get a new grant management system, as well as aligning our grants through grant consolidation at the district level. So we have come up with something called integrated guidance that is aligning 6 to 7 state and federal grants together to make it easy from an administrative burden standpoint for our district partners. We consistently try to find different ways to align some of those grants. I think there is opportunity at DOJ to pursue additional capacity and some process improvement changes around legal sufficiency that can make this process a little more nimble. But largely the thing is that we have the authority to grant the dollars, and DOJ, after a certain threshold, has the authority to tell us if we're meeting a legally sufficient and binding contract. So I believe the next one is questions, right, Ian? Thank you, and questions.
Thank you. So we only have about a minute left on this one. I didn't see anything specific to ODE in the chat, more I think kind of some general questions about that we may want to see if we want to share more broadly than just ODE on this one, at least as far as I can tell. Thought I saw a hand go up and then it went down. So I think we'll say we're okay for now on ODE. Thank you so much for that. If we do get any additional questions, we'll send those to you in writing. Thank you very much for the presentation. I do see a question directed at me around like defining pre-approval. I actually really enjoyed the way the departments have responded to this question in kind of a range. And so I think what we're seeing is like, is it pre-approval of the individual organization, pre-approval of a body of work, pre-approval of a template? And I think that all of those things are encompassed in a process where we're just trying to say, is there any work we can do up front that we stop having so much work at the end to the point where you have been awarded funds and it's still 2, 3, 6 months out before work has begun. I think that's what we're all trying to figure out, is how to move some pieces further ahead so that community isn't waiting so long for the services that they're trying to access. All right, next up we have Oregon Housing and Community Services.
Hi there. I would like to introduce myself. I'm Laura Alamrani. I'm the Assistant Procurement and Business Services Manager for Oregon Housing and Community Services. I have only been with the agency for 6 weeks, and I've been involved in this project largely because our procurement manager has gone on to another agency. So there's been a little bit of upheaval here. This particular presentation is largely a compilation of my communications between program, procurement, and other bodies within our agency, including accounting and budget, as to how the grants work. I'm going to do my best to address any questions as they come up, but I would really encourage anyone who has questions to put them in the chat so that I can have those addressed by some of the folks in the agency who are much better positioned to answer them with current and complete accuracy, because I am afraid I might miss a thing or two. So that being said, let me go ahead and present this. I will say that I am really interested in the fact that this, what I'm about to show you here, it really aligns so much with what the other smaller agencies will be experiencing. And I want to make that different. So our big questions being the start to finish process, what the current systems used are, what's our discretion over grant making, what would it take to have a pre-approval process, what would it take to share grant application information, and differentiating between authority and what it would take to have a shared grant process all across agencies. I'm going to start with our current flow, and I'm not sure why I can't make this bigger.
It looks like it's full screen to me.
There we go. Okay, I'm just seeing something kind of strange on my end, and I'm not sure why that is. So this is a framework of sort of how our process has been going over the last biennium and into this biennium. I put a legend on here. This was given to me by our project management group, that begins with programs submitting requests, the requests getting assigned within procurement services, creation of docs, which includes any vetting by the Department of Justice, and then that's where we go to assigning the attorney and then providing approvals to release requests for applications. And by this time, we're at about 2.5 months, and then soliciting the applications another 30 days, evaluate them for another 30 days, issue intents to award, and then negotiating. So we're talking about, if there is actually a request for application, it's taking just about 3 months. And a lot of, I'm sorry, there's I'm sorry, it's the ones without a request for application are taking about 3 months. The ones that do are taking much longer than that. And I really appreciate the comment that just popped up in the chat. So again, with the length of time, all of the things that we have to go through, really diverse programs, some of which have overlap, most of which do not have direct overlap. That's one of the things that adds to the length of time. There have been a lot of emergency orders over the last couple of biennia that required instant standing up of a certain new process within a program to get the grant money spent before statute required that we be done with that particular program. We also didn't have a lot of staff 2-3 years ago. We've really grown exponentially, largely to facilitate taking care of these grants that are coming through our office now. We've gotten really large. The very next slide I have is all of our systems, and you're going to look at this list and you're going to be going, wow, because that's a lot of really different items. And the primary ones that we're using are Opus for grant management. That is also something that the stakeholders and the grantees can get into. It's something that we can get into, and some grants are done that way. There are just about every grant we're doing is now being placed into Oregon Buys, but as a couple of the other folks have mentioned, Oregon Buys wasn't necessarily set up to receive grants in a neat way and doesn't account for some of the requirements for reporting that grants have. So they're going in there. So they're being memorialized, but there's still tracking that needs to be done that can't be done within Oregon Buys. And then that's where you wind up a little lower down with some things like smart sheets and different types of spreadsheets that the individual programs have. The procurement staff on that team, it specifically has several smart sheets that actually track all of the projects that come across their desks. But then within the programs, they each have sort of individual ones. In some cases, they're aligned with the smart sheet that procurement has. In some cases, they're not. We're actually in the middle of beginning. We're in the middle of the beginning of getting an organizational assessment done on several areas of program and on procurement in this office to see if there's some procedures that we can go ahead and streamline internally. And then as part of that, probably looking at all of these different systems that we use in our grant management process and seeing what can be eliminated, where the redundancies are, and moving forward with that. I kind of agree with the other presenters that also mentioned that a system much like Oregon Buys that is specifically designed for grants would be great. But short of that, if there can be some modifications made to Oregon Buys to sort of have a branch of it that is grant specific, that would mean that we wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel with another statewide system, but have a statewide system with a section that can actually accommodate this kind of different body of work. Let's see, next we have our authority and discretion. We have by statute and by Oregon administrative rule discretion, most of our own discretion. We do have a lot of things that we send through DOJ. All of the grants that exceed or expected to exceed $250,000. If it has an IT element, we also make sure that any procurement documents that we put out, like requests for applications that are above a certain amount, that they review that. We also really err on the side of caution, and DOJ reviews almost anything that we want them to, and that's our practice, is to, if we're in any doubt, we have DOJ review it. The only reasons that DAS review are required, because we are outside of DAS's scope and we have our own authority, is if the grants include any IT elements and if there is a risk that we need to have addressed, because there needs to be insurance around all of these, and having DASK risk management consult with us on those things, make sure that we are including the appropriate amount of insurance. So for what would it take for a grant pre-approval process? And that would go along the lines of what others have said as well, which is a basic universal set of requirements that all grantees must meet, and then see how we can spread those across all of the grant types and sources. That's easier said than done, but I'm trying to remember the exact terminology someone else used earlier, but it really described it well. There's a base type of there are a bunch of questions that you would ask everybody at the beginning of any sort of process like this, and those are the things where it should start as a basic universal set of requirements. For some of our cases, it would simplify matters if there was a minimum amount that an applicant would be guaranteed as a pre-approval. Just certain kinds of things that have to do more with one-time grants, emergency grants. And this little section here was provided to me by one of our program staff, and that is that approval could be obtained for up to $250,000 based on eligibility, but it would be possible to receive a higher amount based on any competitiveness and funds availability. But the only issue with that we could see right out of the gate was too many people applying for those and not being able to meet those obligations. As far as application information sharing, we want a framework in which to share and collect the information. As I said before, similar to the use of organ buys, but specifically designed around the specific needs and constraints of grant administration, which, as we've been told by virtually everyone, differ widely between the grants, the funding, and the programs. We'd need the ability to address those requirements, and it would be necessary to create some kind of an information release system because of the privacy rules around those different things and what would require Freedom of Information Act or other things around that. So our agency authority against legislative action is we don't have to have too much legislative action to conduct our business. We have so many programs that have specific rules with kind of limiting language, and this occasionally will occur in statute, but it's really mostly our rules that create bottlenecks with administering grants. There really has not been any overarching legislation that has created issues with grants. Most of that tended to come from rule. And this particular change is with regard to that's mentioned in ORS 458650 has more to do with some of the emergency requests from the governor's office. And let's see. A shared grant application process would be agreed to and accessible by all participants, meeting the business needs for all the federal grants and state funds, must be robust and dynamic enough to provide for curated agency-specific information gathering, establishes the appropriate authority for that information sharing, uniform agreement on the basic elements, and that would be a profile that any grantee would just kind of go into any of these systems having that profile, and they wouldn't have to recreate the wheel. Ability to utilize this as the basis for all grant applications. They would just need to, once they had their profile entered and were identified in the system, then anything subsequent to that would be specific to whatever opportunity was being applied for. And that was all I had, and I will see if there's any of these. I'm sorry, Marianne, I really meant ROI is what I meant to say there.
So I think there might have been a couple of follow-up questions, but we'll send those to you in writing, and we're going
That
to
would be
save the one.
fantastic.
Yeah. And thank you so much for that. Really appreciate you coming to this space as such a new person and taking on a lot of big questions. So appreciation to you for being here. Thank you so much.
And thank you for everyone's patience.
And then last up, the Oregon Youth Authority.
Okay, thank you everyone. Can everyone see my slides, hear me? Seeing my face isn't super important, so if we're good to go, I'll get us started. So my name is Katie Hudson. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the Oregon Youth Authority, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about our application procedures for our grant agreements. I will say that we are all general fund, so that makes it a little bit less complex in comparison to some of the agencies that have already presented. So right here, we've outlined sort of what our workflow looks like in our application to executed grant agreement process. So we have what I like to call like a rolling application. Our applications for grants are available until our funding budget is out. So we ask folks to request funds based on our funding authority all throughout the year. We do shut down the application process at the end of the biennium just so we can process everything and get through that sort of biennium to biennium jump. But our applications are open pretty consistently. Our application is available online, and we just recently this week moved from a complete an email application to an electronic application that's automatically deposited into the system we utilize for grant management. I did put on here kind of the average number of days that an applicant can expect to be in each step of the process to kind of see an overview of where we might get some longer wait times and what part of the process that happens in. So we have a pretty streamlined process as the application goes to the grant committee. We do have a lot of back and forth if the application is not complete or we want to get more information as the grant committee. We'll do a little bit of back and forth because it's really important for us in terms of the specifics of our authority that we understand completely the request and it meets the eligibility requirements. We do want to work with all of our applicants on meeting that eligibility. So there is a lot of like personal meetings, calls to get them to a place that they're understanding the application and the eligibility requirements. Once we send the committee approval for grants, it gets sent to our agency director for final approval. We do notify approval or denial to applicants as well as the rationale behind the denial if necessary. Approved grant packets are then sent to procurement and the contract administrator, and our procurement does review all of our grant agreements, even though it's not required to be a part of the procurement process. They are our area experts on our grants authority, legal sufficiency, and then we rely on them to let us know as a committee when those applications need to be sent to DOJ, even if it's not meeting the threshold requirements. We've got a really excellent procurement team that does a great job with that. And then at the end of it, an executed agreement is sent to both the contract administrator and the grantee. And the contract administrator takes over sort of the administrative process in connection with the grantee over the period of the grant. So we see a range anywhere between 31 days from application to executed agreement to 68 days. And I did create a little graphic that articulates what could potentially be the factors of those timeline extensions. How do we have 31 days and then 68 days? Most of our work does come from incomplete applications, the back and forth and sort of the meetings and getting the information we need is the number one reason why our timelines get extended. Second would be the legal sufficiency DOJ review. I think a few of my colleagues did articulate that I think DOJ gets overwhelmed with review requests. And so it's not necessarily related to the complexity of the request. It's the bandwidth that they have to review things within, the 30 days that we're looking to get this turned around. Response time to outreach. So we do see delays when the grantee, we're not able to get a hold of the grantee for additional information, or the grantee hasn't set up processes to be able to provide the information. So we walk them through that process. A good example of that is like for grants over a certain dollar amount, we ask that they provide audited financial statements, or for nonprofits that haven't been able to establish professional audited financial statements, we ask them to give us a profit and loss. And we've had some folks that have said, what's a profit and loss? So, we take some time and say, here's what a profit and loss is. And we do some like basic nonprofit accounting, kind of what resources they could, like QuickBooks, right? Like, hey, there's this system that helps with this. And so we do a lot of training, as well as just gathering of information. We are relatively new in our authority, so we do have these hiccups where we recognize the need for process improvement. So if we, with a certain application, find that something's not working, we do spend some time to address that in the moment and improve our process. And sometimes that does add to the timeline for certain grants. Additional reviews, we always want to make sure that we're following the legal sufficiency requirements, and sometimes we refer things out for additional review. We do occasionally have committee non-consensus, and I didn't want to ignore the fact that that does add to timelines, because if our grant committee isn't on the same page, we have to have consensus to move it forward. So we do spend time to like work through what's needed to get us all to approval or get us all to denial, and we will spend extra time to make sure that we're all understanding each application correctly. And then we do, if we do have committee absence to where we're not able to get everyone's consensus for approval, it will potentially move the grants out an additional week. So for systems and information sharing, so this touches on a couple topics. We don't use a grant management system that's clearly defined as such. We use a database system called Smartsheet. We started utilizing the system for workflow and grant tracking, but now we're starting to utilize it in different ways. With the electronic application is a good example. So the electronic application is a form in Smartsheet that automatically deposits into a database that we're able to track the grant through its workflow and track at different aspects of the grant from start to finish, which has been really exciting. We have found that this is shareable with others in our agency based on our licensing. I'm not sure if this would be shareable across the enterprise. Data dashboards can be generated from this database really easily. We can take a spreadsheet and make it a really digestible data dashboard, which has been really great for us in tracking the other metrics we have around grant agreements. There are automations and workflows within Smartsheet, so it can do a lot of the work for you. And I know workload has been a really hard thing for our procurement team. So we're building in automations where the system is doing that kind of work for us and identifying things for us. It'll send out reminders for documents that are required. It's actually a pretty great system to use. The cons to this system, we've had some conversations with our agency chief information officer about utilizing the system too much, and that it potentially cannot be a system of record, which I'm told is more around holding that data for long periods of time, potentially across the enterprise. And then we do make a really solid effort in not putting any confidential information into the system, because we don't have access to the system on the back end in a way that a lot of our other software systems across the state do. So if something goes wrong, or a third party has access to that information that we don't have a lot of control over. So we've been advised by our CIO around those types of things, and we've been given some, best practices from our CIO around what information can go into that system and what needs to stay out because it's not accessible in the back end. And this is an example I shared from our previous presentation around the dashboards that can be created from Smartsheet. Just depending on what you're putting into the application, which has been really great for us when we're talking about reporting around which areas we're funding, how many applications are getting approved and denied, what types of applicants are we approving most of the applications. So it's been really great. It's a visualization versus, giving folks a spreadsheet with a bunch of numbers. So when thinking about what it would take to have a shared grant application process, we definitely need to identify an appropriate system in partnership with information services, just so we can navigate that system of record issue and make sure that we're not creating an issue for the state. I know a lot of folks have said there's a lot of nuance and specificity for the various agencies around their processes and grant authorities. OIA's grant authority is so specific, it was hard for me to identify how our specific authority could be captured in a pre-approval process. Designing and selecting a system that all can use is, I think, more complicated than it sounds. We definitely need to consider systematic barriers that are common in these types of systems that really disadvantage marginalized communities. Enterprise systems have shown, the procurement system itself has shown to create a lot of barriers for folks with state contracting. So I'd like to plug that maybe we don't have the same approach to grant contracting or agreements. Providing support resources for building, navigating, and helping with the system. So not just building the system, but making sure at the same time we're creating resources around navigating it and how to utilize it effectively. Establishing dedicated personnel at each agency for grant administration and grantee support. I know at our agency, we're an agency of many hats, and we don't currently have a designated grant administrator. We add it to folks' plate that are already doing other things. And so to really understand the system and provide the best support, I think at least one person focused on that work would be appropriate. Utilize its system for resources outside of applications and awards. So if the system is built, can we create, a dashboard for nonprofit marginalized communities for resources around common issues, kind of like what I spoke to about nonprofit accounting, helpful organizational tools, sample business models, all of the things that we're seeing when we're talking to our grantees about what's, difficult about navigating these types of processes. And it's a great opportunity to build a community forum and build collaboration around state grants and maybe have a Q&A, chat space, that sort of thing. Our grant decisions, I kind of just divided them really simply. Our grant committee and our agency director, we have oversight over most of our granting agreements and authority. Grants that are clearly covered under our authority, grants under 250,000, and grants that are clear with legal sufficiency. Those basic, we can move them forward, get them processed. Those are typically our 31-day turnaround time grants. When we have to get DAS or DOJ involved, it's grants that are not clearly covered under our authority. If we're questioning, is this eligible, is it not, we'll send it for further review. Grants that are over 250,000 and grant agreements that require extra care to meet legal sufficiency. We do serve a vulnerable population, so we really take extra care in making sure that, everything is legally sufficient, and that we're creating an agreement that's solid. And I mentioned earlier, we do rely on the expertise of our procurement team when to recommend grants. And we have an understanding with our procurement team that grants are not procurement contracts, and we ask them to kind of switch lenses and apply. And that's been a working partnership with the grant committee and procurement, because we never want to put them in a situation where they feel they're not doing their due diligence, but we also want to create an understanding that grants are not contracts. Pre-approvals, I spoke to this a little bit earlier. Pre-approvals for us would be a little bit challenging. We think it would likely result in a similar time commitment, pre-approval process as our full grant request process. We've opted for an expedited grant process over pre-approval just based on the type of request, because we do have health and safety issues. And I did put our authority in there as well. It's really specific to treatment and care needs of adjudicated youth in OIA custody. And we have all of our conversations with DOJ that have been really lengthy are around the specifics of that authority and the care needs of OIA adjudicated youth. I'm gonna kind of give an example of that just so folks kind of know, like, what does that mean? So we do have grants that, so say OAA youth and ODHS youth often are in the same type of provider facility. So this provider requests a grant for program startup costs. OAA can fund only the costs related to the OAA youth, and this is based on how specific our grant authority is. This is challenging for both the agency and the program to navigate because with items like we've had before, like they want a new fire system. We've had DOJ talk about, well, that serves all the youth there, not just OIA youth. So maybe you only fund a percentage of the fire system. And we say, that's not actually a thing. We can't fund a portion of a fire system. So we've had to have some really interesting conversations around our specific grants authority, and it makes pre-approval in that regard just really, really hard because we have to do a lot of like back office work to make these grants solid under our eligibility. And I'm not sure how a pre-approval process would give us that option. These are just
So
links to our.
I'm sorry, we've reached the 15
Oh,
minutes
sure. Well,
for this one.
I'm done.
Oh,
They're just reference links
was this
here.
your last page?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Just reference links. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. If we have any follow-up questions, we'll send those to you in writing. Thank you very much for this presentation. So team, we're going to take a 5-minute break. Although Debbie, if you could stay on for just a minute. So if everyone could come back at 11:30 for the last portion of our meeting today. And then Debbie, so I know you had originally wanted 40 minutes, I think, to do the risk management portion. It looks like even 30 is going to run us to end because we won't have time to look at the questions and things for March. So I'm wondering, do you feel comfortable with a 20-minute, or should we try to reschedule the risk management portion so that you have at least a full 30 minutes, if not actually try to find a way to make the 40 minutes happen?
Yeah, Bonnie is the one presenting, and I don't know if she hung on here. My sense is that people are going to be very. You're here, Bonnie. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Did you hear the question?
I did. I'll come on camera. So, well, I could just go right to our website if you want to, Mercedes. I developed the content just to give a little bit of background about insurance and why we asked some things. But we could just go to our DAS risk management website and go to the risk assessment toolkit and show everybody how that actually works, because there's a lot behind that. And then if we needed to, I could show the PowerPoint and we could talk about insurance types and amounts. I mean, I tried to make it as short as I could. It's like 16 slides, but very high level on its content. So it's really up to you, Debbie and Mercedes, how you would like to proceed. But if it's about trying to make this process faster, I mean, that process is there. It's there for our purpose on contracts and grants. And then we have worked with some of the agencies on some of these larger grants to actually put a template together for them so they can move things through even faster. So I don't know how you'd like to proceed. I could just scratch the PowerPoint. We could go right to the website and look at the toolkit. And if there's questions about the insurance, we can have a conversation about that, but it's up to you.
Yeah. I think I'm kind of leaning towards us trying to fit this into a later presentation, just because this is not an area I think we would necessarily make too many recommendations in, but this is a space that feels like the black box a lot of times. And the number of conversations I'm in where it's like, I don't know, they changed something about the insurance requirement and no one can seem to explain to me why. And they said that they're told that they have to. And like, there's just like all of that, like not sure where it's coming from. And I think that's what we really want, is to understand where these processes come from so we can develop a better like shared foundation. So
yeah. So I think putting it on another agenda, Debbie and Mercedes, would be helpful, because some of the content that I was going to provide around insurance and why you need some of these things would be helpful. because contractual liability is actually brought in under commercial general liability, and people forget that part. So anyway, yeah, if you want to postpone it to another date, I just need to know what date, and that's fine. We could do that.
Okay. Yeah, because I just started to see the clock ticking down, and we already squished you, and we're going to squish it again. And I just have a feeling this is one of the ones where we're going to get questions, and I don't want to have to limit the engagement too much, because I think this is a really important thing for all of us to understand, and how it's working, and especially because all the department, well, not all of them, but most of them did reference the risk management tool. So I think it's important for us to know. So yeah, so when we come back, I think we'll focus on our look ahead, do a preview of the questions that we're wanting to submit to the agencies, any additional things folks want to hear, and then we'll make sure that when we look at our next agenda planning meeting, that we schedule a good chunk of time, and that we try to stay. Maybe we even let you all go first. And then get into some of the presentations, whether that's in March or maybe April, but we'll follow up with you as soon as we make that determination.
Sounds good. So I'll just get off of this one, if that's okay with you. I'll go talk to my boss about a Senate bill that's going on. And if that's okay with you, and then I'll come back in March, and Shelley might be able to actually be here too, which would be good.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Bonnie.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
And sorry I didn't give you a break, Debbie.
It's okay. It's no problem. No problem at all. And I do think it's going to be a very meaty presentation where we need the time.
Agreed. Okay. So we're coming back to about 11:30. If folks are back from the very short break, I apologize for being so short. I just get some thumbs up maybe, so I can see if folks are back at their desks yet. Maybe not yet. I saw one hand. If you could throw up a little hand, or maybe turn your camera on just so I can get a sense of who's back. Okay, there we go. Now I'm starting to see some hands. Thank you, folks. Okay. Okay, so what we've decided, if you actually did take your break, which I hope you did, what we've decided is for the last part of our agenda is we're going to take our risk management presentation we were going to do at DAS, and we're going to move it to another day. Initially, the department had asked for 40 minutes. We kind of squished that to 30. If we do that, that's basically the entire time, and then we don't have time for any kind of debrief here or to look ahead to the March meeting, which means that we're squishing them down to 20 minutes. But I think it's important for all of us to have a good understanding of the risk management tool and the insurance work, because it has been something that I think has been just, people are becoming more aware of it. It's becoming more of a thing that we're all talking about, especially as insurance gets more and more expensive for organizations. And so really understanding how the state agencies utilize that system, how they make those requirements, I think is going to be really good foundation information for us. Jonathan, do you want to add something?
No, we're good. I definitely saw some random questions come regarding DOJ involvement. So I think Kirk answered perhaps the most substantive one, but some of them dealt more with process. Anything you could think of?
As far as more questions for DOJ?
Yes.
I think we will definitely continue to have more questions for DOJ. I think we had a couple in the chat here, and then we've also been discussing a standalone memo that we were going to request from DOJ. The more we understand from the agencies, I think the better we're able to articulate what our questions are. And so we'll definitely be getting back to you on that.
Okay, that sounds
okay,
good.
so on the screen, you're going to see the 6 questions that we currently have for the state agencies on wages. So our presentation in March is going to be about how do we create processes that get us to achieve more livable wages in the contracts and grant agreements that we're partnering on. So you can see the questions there. You know, when making, the first one is really about when a department is deciding we're trying to serve 100 households and we're going to award, you know, grants or contracts of up to $100,000. How did they determine that $100,000 is going to pay for 100 households? Right? Like that's what we're trying to get at, is what calculations are being used to pair those requirements with the amount of funds that are going to be allowable in the grant or the contract. When it comes to ongoing grants and contracts, again, that same calculation for like, this is how much service I want, this is how much money I'm going to allow to accomplish that service. When it's ongoing, is inflation and COLA included in that calculation? As for the agencies, when you're requesting money from the state, are you including that at that moment? When does that get included? Does it not? Again, just trying to understand how we get to the point where we have an amount of service and an amount of money. Who did the math to decide those match up, or what math is being done better? What math is being done? What methodology is being used to determine that those things match? If the state of Oregon were to adopt the federal laws, including the uniform guidance in grant making, what ORS or OARs would allow or disallow the use of these guidelines. I did ask when Amy sends out these questions to include a link to the uniform guidance. So if anyone's unfamiliar with it, they can take a look. This has come up, I think, a couple of times in discussion about OMB and the uniform guidance. This is try to us get a sense of what are agencies' engagement with this federal guidance? When is it used or not used? Where is it capable of being used or not used? Then we're going to ask you if agencies are inviting grantees to co-create RFPs. So this, I think, goes into that planning phase, like folks who are sharing that workflow, that very first planning, like identifying that need. I think we want to understand how much of that work is being done like really kind of insular to the department versus how much of that work is a partnership with communities most impacted. This might include like if your department has advisory councils or like formal bodies like that. Like I think thinking about where is it that you're gathering feedback, you know, are potential grantees, current grantees allowed to even sit on your advisory bodies, or do you exclude them? Right. So like thinking about where you're gathering information, probably in that first line, that planning workflow portion. This is going to kind of help us connect back to that first question, which is like, if you're co-creating some of that, does that help us get closer to matching service expectations in dollars? Does it not impact that at all? Is it about something different, that kind of partnership? So just understanding where those external voices can impact the decisions that your agency is making. Does your agency request funding based on outcomes to be achieved, or is funding based on some other calculation? So this again is thinking about current service level. What are the pieces that go into requesting that? Is it about what's kind of just budgetarily available? Or is it like we've been serving 50 households and we want to serve 100, so we're going to ask for a scaled up amount? Also want to make sure folks are aware that like a 50% increase in outcomes doesn't always equate to a 50% increase in funding. So like how are you kind of calculating when you want, what kind of outcomes you want and how much money is being associated with those outcomes? I think it's a little bit different from like, we want to spend a certain amount of money on like a thing, like we're going to buy a thing, right? When it comes to a lot of the nonprofit partnerships, we may be buying things, but we're also looking at other kinds of intangible outcomes. For what reason would your agency reject a nonprofit submitted budget? So this is kind of going a little bit deeper into some of those procurement processes, that phase of work where you put out an application, you've accepted an application, maybe you've even said we want to award you funds, but we're not going to award you the amount of funds you requested or in the way in which you requested them. We're going to augment your budget. So we're rejecting the budget you submitted and we're asking for a change, either telling you what to change or asking you to just submit a new one with some revisions. What are the reasons why that might happen? And then number 6, does your agency have recommendations on increasing wages through your partnership? So all throughout this process, I think we've heard little bits that folks are doing some innovative stuff and doing some great partnership work. So you may already have some recommendations that you have for like ways in which you've seen wages be more stable in your partnerships. Maybe that's to a different payment model. We saw less complaints about that and more engagement around that. Or when thinking about the way you've put out an application resulted in some better wages. Do you know? Do you not know? Right? Like thinking about just any recommendations you might have for all of us. One of the other things that we had been talking about, and I kind of mentioned this at the top of the meeting, which was that we want to maybe think a little bit differently about how we're organizing information based on different folks' requests for organizing information. One of the recommendations that we got from some folks on our project planning subcommittee and then in our agenda planning committee is to have something where we're actually comparing agencies to each other in more of a spreadsheet format where we can see between them what things they're doing or not doing. It does mean we kind of have to bring our questions down to like simple answers to be able to see that. So in our agenda planning meeting, what we did is we tried to look at some of these same questions, some similar different questions, and turn them into like yes, no, or short answer questions that could be put in a survey platform. So I'm going to show you what the survey looks like right now. Oh gosh, and then it got small, didn't it? Sorry about that. Try to make it bigger again.
No, we can see it. It's okay.
Oh, okay. It just looked like it turned tiny on my screen. So here, so this is pretty short. There's only a few questions here. Some of these are repetitive, again, just to put it in that kind of comparative format. So does your agency have a formula for determining amounts of service or outcomes you expect to get per dollar? So just do you have a methodology? Yes or no? Are you using the uniform guidance? Do you have the authority to use the uniform guidance? Does your agency invite grantees to do that RFP? Does your agency have standard templates for grant applications? And does your agency stipulate how much is allowed to be spent on wages in a contract or agreement or an approved budget or contract agreement, right? So it's either in the actual application you say you can only spend so much on wages. Is it in the grant agreement where you say you can only spend so much on wages? Is it when they submit that budget and you're negotiating what's allowed in the budget where you might say, only X amount or X percentage is allowed for wages? Like, just are you stipulating to some degree what is allowed and where it is allowed? So these are all questions that were based on that, on going back to our Jamboard activity from way far ago now, it feels like. And so that's where these questions came from. But before we wrap up, we've given these to the agencies so far. So this is kind of like they've already been told to answer these questions. So my question for all of you here is there anything that's missing of information that you think you need that's either kind of a comparative yes, no, kind of up or down question that we put in the survey, or something where you'd like to hear a little bit more narrative about how processes are working or decisions are being made around wages that you don't see currently up here. So I'm going to go back to this here just to see that again. These are the 6 questions. The questions in the survey do reflect these in more of that yes, no format. The presentations, we're hoping to see more explanation, more narrative about these answers to these questions. And so from task force members, is there anything that's missing? Marianne.
So when we had the preschool promise with Delk, they actually had minimums for teachers' wages. So that was very helpful, but I don't know how many other contracts have that.
Okay, we can make that, I think, add that to the survey question as a yes, no for now. And then maybe add it as a sub question to number 6. Do you have wage minimums? Bettina.
Yeah, I already put it in the chat, but my question was around those other costs like health insurance, PTO, paid family leave. Those are real costs in terms of what employers can pay. So if we might under one, just maybe ask how they consider those costs because it's capacity.
So we're asking
how they consider general benefits, competitive benefits like health insurance, PTO, sick leave into those calculations, or what is an adequate wage budget to provide services.
Okay. So maybe we'll actually just change the wording here to say wherever it says wages, we're asking for wages and benefits. So
I think that would be helpful.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that would be
Then
helpful.
we don't have to ask a brand new question, but just stipulate we want to know wages and benefits allowance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great. Anything else on that one? Okay. Well, great. So not too much had to change. Summer, I'll email you after this with some assistance in kind of getting that updated list out to all of the agencies for those questions. And then with our last few minutes here, I'm gonna wait, I should stop sharing. Sorry, I don't need to do that right now. So with our last few minutes, I would love to hear if anyone has any just reflections on the presentations from today that you want to share as like a checkout.
I think it's really surprising how different agencies really manage things and how some have no systems, like no online systems, but are like still doing spreadsheets and stuff. That's just pretty fascinating. And it kind of seems like the procurement folks would also like support around solutions, which I think is really promising. And I'm hopeful.
Lisa?
First of all, Mercedes, thank you for guiding us through 3 hours of presentations. You are a saint. You are appreciated. Very much what Heather was saying, it's sort of fascinating to me because I'm thinking about how we do our internal practices. And I mean, if I understood DHS, they have 200 programs and no internal grant system. And that seems cruel to do to staff. And I'm thinking about some of the like low hanging fruit and some of the recommendations we might make and what are the costs associated with that and how government really appreciates efficiency and expect it of the nonprofits. So let's make sure the government can do it as well. So those are the things coming up for me, and just much appreciation to everyone who presented. I thought it was very informative. Thanks.
Agreed. I did appreciate how much, like, although we got, I think, notes of caution around some kind of pre-approval thing, I think somebody said it really well, like an organizational profile, like even just some sort of system to manage an organizational profile for those things that people ask for all the time, kind of almost an early vetting. Sounds like there are ways to support that, which is really exciting. And yeah, I definitely heard people kind of hungry for some support. Danish.
Yeah, I also want to express appreciation to Mercedes and all the 8 agencies that presented. I'm sure these presentations took time and energy to prepare, so really very useful. I guess, I have a flair for the obvious, and one point that's coming up for me is that logic doesn't always win the day. And so it's interesting. I think it was Kirk who was saying from ODHS that, modifications have been made out of necessity, right? Agencies have tried to figure out how to make it work, and that in order to shift from that, there's an acculturation process that needs to happen. So it's not as simple as just sort of saying, let's do it one way. And so a little to Felicita's low-hanging fruit point, knowing that there's some acculturation that has to happen, I was starting to think about, whether or not there's some natural groupings here, like those that receive general funds, for example, that came up with Oregon Youth Authority, all general funds. Presumably there's different, a lower level of complexity there. So perhaps there's a way to think about how agencies with more flexibility can operate and agencies with less flexibility can operate. And maybe that offers us some starting points for thinking about the acculturation process and how to move towards something that is not so disparate at this point. Similarly with DOJ, knowing that a lot of roads lead back to DOJ, hearing that capacity may be a real issue at DOJ, it'd be good to probe that area as well to figure out if that's a starting point. So those are a few thoughts that popped to mind. Lots of good information, and again, appreciate it, folks.
I'll say for me, I really liked the idea of some consolidation around that kind of organizational profile idea. Like there is going to, and I did put that as a follow-up question for the agencies, like if we could actually just collect what those standard questions are that you ask every single time. And if there's a way for even that to just be, all right, how do we unify that, right? Understanding that specific funding sources and specific program goals are going to need maybe some separate process. But if everyone is asking for a certain number, for a certain group of things that we can clearly see across departments, that's, I think, where we can start with that question of a unified process. And I think that's what kind of speaks to a little bit of pre-approval, right? Is how do you know you can work with a nonprofit? How do you know that nonprofit is like, has their 990, has their Secretary of State staff, has their insurance staff, where you're more vetting their capabilities on a skill strengths level, because we've already pre-approved and pre-vetted the bare minimum, right? I think that's an exciting thing for me. I do wonder if we can get to a standard open period. I think it would be really really helpful for organizations to know that every time an RFP is out, you've got 45 days, regardless of what department, regardless of how big or small. That one sounded like a potential to me. I saw a range of about 30 to 50 days, I think, in the presentations. I definitely wouldn't want to go short of where somebody's standard practice is, but that's one that's kind of swirling for me. Bettina.
Yeah, the other thing I was wondering about, what's the difference between ongoing contracts and new legislative, monies or changing ones? There's so many things that those departments do biennium to biennium, and why this process is still so complicated. Why is there, what could be done to make those rollovers more easily? Because it appears that there's a lot of work still on what is actually ongoing work. The state won't stop doing it. Maybe there is a funding change, that's the other part, does funding go down and up? But the contracts themselves with school districts or with, health departments, how could that be made easier for those departments versus the ones where there's new contracts because there's a new allocation of money, and we have to go through a new process of establishing. But I didn't hear much about that in terms of what could make it easier for those ongoing contracts where they're stop and go, but the stop and go seems to be very time intensive for departments.
Absolutely. I think we heard that in the last time. And I think somebody said something about, needing to figure out how to get beyond the legislative session. Like how can the legislative session and essentially the budgeting authority of individual grants and contracts be a little bit separate? I do think that sounds really interesting and exciting, and especially right now, thinking it's legislative session, so also want to appreciate all of the agencies for being able to show up here while we know you were all in session. And one of the things coming up there is a summer learning investment, right? That's a bill this session, and that one's really hard because no matter what, it seems that decision is made in like the 11th hour plus 50 minutes because of the timeline of the session, right? And like, even if that is something we want to do, how do we realign those timelines? So it's really helpful. It's really helpful to get a sense of where, agencies have recommendations, where they have experience, where you feel things are going really well. So I also really appreciated folks coming with their kind of strongest foot forward of like, here's our bleeding edge of our innovation. That's really helpful to know and understand. So thank you for doing that. I think I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting there. I don't see any other hands up. So we're going to kind of just take that last 6 minutes. I hope you have time for a little bit of break. I hope everyone gets lunch after this before you have to immediately go into your next meeting. But thank you all so much for the time today, the thinking and working together. Summer, as I said, I'll send you a little bit of a follow-up about how we get the agencies those just slightly modified questions for our March presentation. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.